Started. Okay, well, wonderful.
Okay.
Welcome, wildlife enthusiasts. I'm Aletris Niels, the Executive Director of Conservation Catalyst. And Conservation Colloquy is a transdisciplinary platform for holistically unraveling problems between people and wildlife. Wildlife Wednesday is a free webinar for wildlife professionals and students interested in wildlife coexistence. These take place the first Wednesday of every month. Those of you new to Conservation Colloquy, you're in for a real treat. We have an innovative presentation by a global expert that's applicable to participants around the world, followed by an informal question-answer period and a discussion session, which is my favorite part. Not only can you join us via Zoom, but we are also streamed live on Facebook, and these will be recorded and posted on the Conservation Catalyst website. So each month we highlight interdisciplinary scientists conducting relevant research, and our guest today is all of these things and more. Gail Thomson is a carnivore conservationist who's worked in South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana on human-carnivore conflict, community conservation, and wildlife monitoring. She's interested in promoting clear public communication of science and conservation efforts. I was really fortunate to work with Gail in Namibia a number of years ago, and I was so impressed by her ability to seamlessly move between applied conservation and talking with farmers and scientists. And she really is a phenomenal bridge, as you will see in a minute, between these two worlds. And Gail truly does shine in the field. This is where she belongs, and she's one of those rare people that you will absolutely never be disappointed with joining your conservation team. We're also highlighting Gail as a wonderful woman of wildlife for her pioneering conservation work, promoting diversity in the conservation field. So it's with an absolute great pleasure that I introduce Gail Thomson. So thank you, Gail.
Right. Thank you very much for your kind words, Aletris, half of which I'm sure I do not deserve. But yeah, I think Aletris has said a lot of it by way of introduction, and I think I'll just jump in. So the talk that I want to do today is not so much research. I could regale you with my research on livestock guarding dogs in Namibia, but everything I could tell you in a presentation, you could also read in publications, scientific publications. So I won't focus so much on the research aspect, but rather I want to talk about something that's quite close to my heart. And that is how we link science with society. So the sort of society I'm talking about is the header photo that I have here, a chap with his family, the guy that's standing there, the big guy, is a game guard for a communal conservancy. I'll explain what that is as part of the talk. And his young family have received these little lights. I think if you can have a look, the little kid is holding one of them, and another light is attached to the kraal over there. And the idea behind these lights is that they flash intermittently and deter predators from jumping into kraals. But the point that I really want to get from this photo is how do we bring scientific discoveries, new ideas, particularly in the field of conservation, and especially in human-wildlife conflict, how do we bring those ideas to the ground level in such a way that we actually promote human-wildlife coexistence? So just in terms of my background, I was raised and grew up in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa. I think if you can see my cursor, I'll be using it to point out what I'm indicating. So I went to university there for 4 years, what in South Africa is called a BSc Honours. And then for a year before I did my master's, I went and I lived on the opposite side of the country in a place called Kamiskroon. The region where Kamiskroon is located is Namaqualand. So when I talk about Namaqualand in the talk, you know what I'm talking about here in the west coast of South Africa. So I did a year of volunteering there with an organization that conserved leopards before I figured out what I wanted to do for my master's. And in doing so, I discovered livestock guarding dogs that had been used in Namaqualand before, and they were placed there originally by a company called Cheetah Conservation Fund, also a non-government organization. And the farmers in Namaqualand told me that these dogs came from Cheetah Conservation Fund, and they were hopeful that this would be a solution for livestock losses caused by, in the case of Namaqualand, it was caracals, jackals, and leopards. But Cheetah Conservation Fund, as the name suggests, is all about cheetahs. And Namibia hosts a fairly good population of cheetahs, along with Botswana. That's the biggest population of cheetahs in Africa. And their focus on what my master's was on was the livestock guarding dogs in the country, which are placed throughout Namibia. So I spent a lot of time traveling through Namibia and talking to farmers of all sorts of different backgrounds about livestock guarding dogs and their livestock. From there, I spent 2 years in the northwest of Namibia, a place called Wildlife, which is Afrikaans for the end of the world. So if you ever want to find the end of the world, I can tell you it's a beautiful place. And I lived there for 2.5 years, camping in that area and working with what are known as communal conservancies in northwest Namibia. I learned an awful lot in that time period, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this talk is from my experiences that I got there. Once I had finished that project, I moved with who is now my husband, Rob Thompson, and we moved to Maun in Botswana. Unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of opportunity in Botswana due to funding constraints, so I didn't work with communities so much, but we did wildlife monitoring in the concessions in northern Botswana. So that's just basically who I am, where I come from, and I'll be referring to all of these places as we go along. So in terms of background of what we're going to be talking about today, I also want to give you an idea of the wildlife background, particularly in Namibia, but also some of this applies to South Africa. And these concepts you just need to understand so that when I talk about freehold farmers or private farmers, you know what I'm talking about. And when I switch to communal conservancies, you understand what I'm talking about, so I don't leave anyone behind. If I do leave anyone behind, do let me know. So the background here is in Namibia and South Africa, they both have a similar sort of history in that they were both subject to the apartheid government. And during that time, there was a very big difference in terms of land tenure. So you would have what we call freehold land or private land. And during the apartheid era, all the private land that was divided up into different farms were called freehold farms, and those could be sold and the title deed given to the farmer. And during that time, the farmer who was eligible to buy a farm would have to be white, so it was based on race. And all the other people who moved off these farms often were then taken to what were known back then as the homelands, which today are known as communal lands. And into these homelands, the Black people were translocated, as it were, relocated, and basically they had no choice about it. And whatever livestock or crops they were going to grow, they had to grow on the communal land. Another important thing about communal land is that there's usually not much in the way of fencing. So because you don't have a private property, as it were, you can't really fence off large areas. And you have to apply to the chief to ask for permission to fence any part of the land. So if you want to build a house, you have to get permission from the traditional authority. If you want to plant a maize field or mahango field, you have to get permission from the traditional authority to put up a fence and plant your fields or whatever you want to do. The other big difference is that on the freehold farms, generally, the idea behind farming is very much commercial. So it's a sort of European way of farming. It's all about selling your livestock or your crops for commercial gain, and it's run on business, sort of a business basis. Commercial farmers tend to be more wealthy because you have one farmer on a fairly large property with quite a large number of livestock or crops. Whereas on communal lands, generally speaking, people practice more subsistence farming. And this is either livestock or crops, depending which part of the country you're in. And although it's called subsistence farming, in some cases it's a misnomer. There are some people in communal lands that keep a lot of livestock, over 100, 200 livestock. And so they are, in their terms, wealthy. However, they usually don't practice their livestock farming in a way that they would sell their excess. So in a commercial farm, you sell all the calves, you sell, whereas in a subsistence livestock farming situation, they keep their livestock herds as their bank, as it were. So instead of selling their excess, they just build up their herds, and herd numbers is what they're after. So that's how the land works. But then there's also overlaid on top of that is wildlife ownership. So on private land, in the 1970s, particularly 1975 in Namibia, what the government did at the time, so Namibia came to dependence in 1990. So apartheid went up until 1990, Namibia got its independence, and South Africa followed soon after in 1994. But under the apartheid government, private landowners from 1975 onwards were allowed to own the wildlife on their land. In particular, I'm talking about the common wildlife species, so what we would call plains game here. So that's zebra, gemsbok, springbok, kudu, things that are more common, usually the antelope. And the idea behind that was to give the private farmers an incentive to keep that wildlife on the land, which worked very well because farmers started looking after the livestock and after their game as well as their livestock. And it also caused some farmers to fence their land with game fencing, very high game fences, and actually buy in wildlife, get rid of their livestock and buy wildlife. So that's what happened on private land. And then after independence, particularly in Namibia, so this didn't happen in South Africa, it was just in Namibia, the government of the time kept the status quo for a while. The white farmers were allowed to use the game that came onto their property, whereas people living in the communal lands, where there are no fences, had no rights to the game on those areas. It belonged entirely to the government. And what they found is that while wildlife was increasing substantially on the private farmlands, it was decreasing on the communal lands, mainly through poaching, but also through drought. And so they realized that they needed a change. And long story short, what they basically did is told communities that they could get the same ownership rights over wildlife as private farmers if they formed what is called a conservancy. Now, in the map here on the right, you'll see Hariwas Conservancy. I hope I said that right. It's Damaranama for Elephant's Corner. And to give you an idea of its size, private land in Namibia, the farms can be quite big, 40 square kilometers, 50 square kilometers is quite normal for a private farm in Namibia. This communal conservancy, however, is 10 times that size, more like 330 square kilometers. So it's huge. And how people make conservancies is a community self-identifies. So they basically say, we who live in this village are quite closely related to the people who live in that village, and we know the people who live in the north, and they are what we would consider our own community. And so they would get their community together, and they would define their land that falls under that they use for livestock that they feel is the area that they utilize. And then they had to discuss these boundaries with their neighbors. And once their neighbors had agreed, they would then map that land. So this boundary of this conservancy is not a fence. It's just a line on a map. So with a supporting organization, this community got this whole area mapped with the GPS. And then they had to establish a constitution, and then they were allowed this very similar wildlife rights as private landowners. So that is basically what a communal conservancy is. I won't go into much more detail because we don't have that much time, but if you want to know more about what a communal conservancy is and how it works, I'll be quite happy to answer questions at the end. So with that background, let's talk about what I really want to talk about today. And that is some of the practical things that I've discovered during my career that I certainly wouldn't have found out in university. So there was when I was at university, I did a science degree. And back then we were a bit snooty about being scientists, and we always looked down our noses slightly at the social scientists. Mainly because it seemed that we were doing an awful lot of work and they were partying. So we decided that the abbreviation for a Bachelor of Social Science actually was being social. It was BSOC, stood for being social, because we were all working really hard as scientists and they were just partying all the time. Whether or not that's true, I can't tell, but that was our perception at that time. But now that I've grown up somewhat, I hope, and I'm a little bit older and wiser, I've realized that there's actually something quite important here. And that is there's a difference between science in general, and here I will lump my own science with social science because, as we know, human-wildlife conflict is interdisciplinary. So we use both social aspects of social science and aspects of biological science to create solutions. But there's a difference between the sciences and being social. And I've actually found in my career, having left university and during my master's, that sometimes being social has a lot going for it. And there are things that we can learn from being social that we'll never learn at university. So this is the sort of thing I mean. In terms of conducting a survey, so being a scientist, you always want to get the figures, get the numbers, get the stats. So you need a sufficient sample size. You need to talk to as many people as possible. You have 20 questions and they have to be answered accurately and succinctly. And maybe you have a tape recorder and you have paper and pen and you're out there and you've got a bit of a time limit. So you've got to get these 10 surveys done in this village before moving on to the next village. So you've got to really hammer through the questions. And I've always found in the surveys that I've done, there's a bit of pressure. There's always there's time pressure. There's also pressure on you. Are you asking the questions correctly? Is the respondent really understanding what you're asking? And so on. So there's a lot of tension, and I've never really found that I get much connection with my respondents. I simply ask the questions, they answer the questions, I go and analyze their data. However, on the other side, I've found that drinking tea and eating cake is a really successful way of doing conservation. And this is the opposite, really, of doing a survey, because you have no prior agenda. You don't want information out of people. You're just there to socialize. So particularly with commercial farmers, the private farmers that are a bit wealthier, whenever you go to their farm, these are often Afrikaans people, sometimes German people in Namibia, and they have a very strong hospitality streak. So you can never enter a farm, do what you need to do on the farm and leave without them at least offering you a cup of tea and probably a scone and a cake and something else. And so certainly in my time in the Macroland, I put on a lot of weight because I spent quite a bit of time with my colleague there, drinking tea and eating cake. But what I found in that experience is that you get to really bond with the people, and you get to understand what it's like to be a farmer, and you get to ask them questions, random questions that you wouldn't necessarily put in your survey. And you get to understand a lot more nuance that way than you would from your usual survey. Another example is having to go off once you've done your sample, your survey with your sufficient sample size. You as the scientist have to go and analyze your data and publish your results. And there's a lot of pressure to get it all done, and there's a mountain of data. There's lots of statistics you have to learn. You have to push through. I'm sure a lot of the people listening know what that's like. But then on the other side is living locally. And a particularly wise man, one of my mentors, who sadly has passed away, Garth Owen Smith, he gave me some good advice when I was working in Kunene, and he said, don't come in, do a study, talk to people, and then go away to analyze your data and publish your results. He says, rather find a local base, find somewhere in the field to live and be around for people, and so that you can just talk to them and like a normal person, and not be the scientist coming to ask questions and get data out of you. And the other thing you can do while you're living local is that you can offer lifts to people. So particularly in northwest Namibia, people are forever looking for lifts because the nearest town is 100, sometimes 200 k's away, and their only form of transport is a donkey cart. So they would much rather have a lift with a vehicle. So if you have a vehicle, Garth advised me, pick people up and take them to town and talk to them, just have a conversation. And that was some really good advice, I thought. Then on the social science side, there's also pressure, of course, and there's also a goal to becoming an expert, and you want to advance your field of knowledge. You want to know more about the state of human-wildlife conflict, perceptions, attitudes, all the interesting intricacies of interactions between humans and wildlife. So your ultimate goal is you want to become an expert and be respected in your field, and as I say, publish your results. But I found effective conservation, really effective conservation, where you see change, is more based on building trust and creating relationships. So even the best expert in the world will not be listened to with the same level of attention as someone who has built trust and created relationships on the ground. Particularly Garth, who I mentioned earlier, he was particularly good at that, and he had no formal, he went to university for a year, decided it wasn't for him, dropped out, and went out and looked for mentors to teach him about ecology. And he started the community-based conservation. He was a very big influence in establishing communal conservancies, and he did that through building trust and creating relationships. Once again, there's a goal or an aim in social science to study perceptions, to know why people think the way they do, why they believe your particular species is very dangerous when it's not actually that dangerous, and you want to know why and what you can do to change those. But really, when it comes to on the ground changing people's perceptions, that is extremely difficult, and it's a lot more difficult to change perceptions than to study them. So I find often we lead, as scientists, we lean towards the low-hanging fruit, and that's studying the problem. Trying to change perceptions, people's long-held traditional beliefs, is a totally different thing. But that is the sort of thing that being social, the list on the right, can actually lead to. Then there's the difference between giving advice and creating solutions. So I found that particularly people who are regarded as experts in their field, they are brought in to a situation or the government brings them in to provide advice. And perhaps they go to a farmer and they say, well, you have a problem with cheetahs. Well, I have studied cheetahs and I know that this is what they do. So this is what you must do to stop your livestock losses. Now, you may or may not have much success that way. I've often found that in some farming communities, they've had a lot of advice. They've heard every kind of advice you could think of. And they are tired of it, frankly. Whereas if you take a different approach, and that is you create solutions with the farmers, and there's a research group in Namibia who are particularly good at this, and they go in and they ask the farmer to help them learn about their study species so that they can find solutions that work for his particular situation. So they don't go in with, although they have the knowledge, they don't go in with the I will give you a bit of advice idea. They go in with the attitude of, let's learn what's going on here together and let's create the solutions. And I found that that is far more effective. Furthermore, as a scientist, you might get the opportunity to provide input into policy. And I think that's amazing. I think that's one of the sort of things we really aim for as conservationists, to get a chance to give real input that the government takes on board into wildlife policies. However, policies only go so far. Very often policies are made, laws are changed, and the people on the ground may simply ignore the rules. And they often do, particularly in rural areas in Southern Africa. The police are never going to catch you. So you're almost a law unto yourself, particularly the commercial farmers. So if the commercial farmers or even the rural farmers in communal areas are not on board with the new legislation, then you might very well be wasting your time. The alternative is grassroots movements, starting from the ground up. And that really is what communal conservancies are all about. They were started not by a policy change in the government, but from the ground up that led to a policy change in the government. So the people, what Garth and his colleagues did was that they rallied the people around the idea of wildlife conservation. And then it got to the point where the people went to the government and demanded that they receive the same sort of conditional ownership rights over wildlife as private farmers did. And that grassroots movement led the government to have a change in policy. And that is why it is such a sustainable and successful program that it is today. All of that said, I don't want to dismiss all of the stuff on the left, certainly not. I think there's an awful lot that can be said for the science, and without leading with some science, without getting some solid information and solid data, we're shooting in the dark and we don't really know what we're doing. So we really need the science and we need the scientists to do that. However, as a conservationist, not just as a conservation scientist, I would really like seeing us move to a place where we can do both. And I think that's a very high bar to be able to do both, because the pressure that is created from the stuff on the left, there's time pressure, there's trying to go forwards in your career and make a difference in your field, is really on a totally different time scale as the stuff on the right. And the stuff on the right is really the pace at which Africa works. Africa doesn't work on a 3-year PhD. It takes a hell of a lot longer than that to make people believe in you and trust in you and believe that your solutions might be worth trying. So I'd really like to move to the point in conservation where conservation scientists and professionals are able to do both of these things and both build their expertise, publish their results, and at the same time build local trust and start creating solutions with the people on the ground. So just a few anecdotal stories from my side. of some of the things I learned from being social. So I learned a lot in my scientific endeavors in my career. And I published a few articles and whatnot. But I also learned a lot from being social. One example, perhaps a negative example to start with, was the conservation organization I worked for in South Africa, the western side of South Africa, Namaqualand. We had an incident where a leopard was caught in a gin trap, what's also known as a leg hold trap. And the trap was set for a caracal, and thankfully it was quite a small trap. So a caracal's foot is obviously a lot smaller than a leopard's. So because of that, the leopard wasn't that injured. It could very easily be treated by a vet, and we released it. So far, so good, very successful. But so we had spent about 7 months prior to this incident with the farmers in this area. It was a brand new part of the project, and we were just getting to know them, and we had spent an awful lot of time drinking tea and eating cake and getting to know the farmers. However, after this incident, our boss, who wasn't living in the same area, he was running the program from another part of South Africa. He went back and he released a story about this incident to the media. And the media ran it in a newspaper article, and the farmers we were working with read this article, and it basically said that farmers in Namaqualand are awful. They are killing all the biodiversity in South Africa. Gin traps should be banned. Look at what nasty things they did to this poor leopard, and so on. So the farmers were extremely upset, and it very nearly ended our project. They were pretty close to telling us to pack our bags. And what we were doing there in terms of research at the time was setting camera traps to establish the status of the population there. And most of our cameras were on their land. So if those farmers decided that they weren't going to work with us anymore, we could basically take all our camera traps and leave, and we would never be able to even establish the status of that population. Long story short, the organization we worked for had to do a very quick PR job, and they managed to calm the farmers down with an apology, and we apologized on behalf of our boss, and finally they let us quite graciously carry on working there. But that just showed to me, and it stayed with me all this time. That happened in 2008, so that was quite a while ago, and I still remember that process quite vividly. And I realized that there is a place for activism, but it's a very small place. And sometimes activism, particularly against the sorts of people you have to work with, is really not, it doesn't work. It's counterproductive. The next story that I want to share with you is from Northwest Namibia. I went out to go and interview some farmers about their experiences with cheetahs and with leopards and caracals. I wasn't focusing on one species at this time, just all carnivores. But before I went out there, I had worked for 3 years at CCF, at Cheetah Conservation Fund, and this was a new job that I was working on in a new area. However, the farmer that I met had no idea where I came from or what my background was. But when I was introduced to him, they told him that I was here to talk about predators. And he was like, yes, I want to talk about predators. That's exactly what I want to talk about. Let me show you my 3 cheetah skins. And he was hoping that I would buy his cheetah skins from him, which I told him was unfortunately illegal, so I wasn't going to do that. But he wanted to tell me what he wanted to do more than sell his cheetah skins. As you can see, they're in pretty bad condition. More than that, he wanted to tell me his story. And his story was that he caught these 3 cheetahs, a coalition of males, had jumped into his kraal and were killing his goats. I think he had lost quite a few goats at that point. And so he got up, saw what was happening, and shot them. That is not a new story. That happens all the time. But what was interesting to me is our discussion after that. I put the question to him: if you were me, what would you do about it? What solutions would you come up with? And he was like, I've got a solution. I know a cheetah conservation organization that operates there outside Oshivaronga. He had never been there, but he had heard about it. And I think that they have a good business model there. What they do is they put a whole bunch of cheetahs in captivity, and then they charge tourists to see the cheetahs. Now, he doesn't clearly understand the idea of a non-profit organization, and then it's all about conservation, etc., etc. That was not what he was interested in. He was interested in the fact that people came to this place and paid money to see these animals. And these animals were in camps that didn't have any livestock in them. So it was the perfect solution. The cheetahs are over here in the camps. The livestock are out there. They never meet each other. The farmers make their money out of livestock. And these people who keep captive animals make their money out of cheetahs. And that's great. So he was like, it's a win-win, isn't it? It's perfect. So it's just what struck me about this conversation is that it gave me a new perspective on what captivity and captive animals mean to different people. And I would have never have gained this perspective if I hadn't gone out there and just listened to his story. I couldn't fix his problem, but I found he taught me a lot about what captive animals mean to different people. So my third story, and I only have 4, so don't worry. I hope you're not too impatient. Was also in the northwestern part of Namibia, in the communal conservancies, where elephants are free ranging. And this story was particularly heart-wrenching for me. And the key lesson that I learned from it was you really, sometimes all you can do is listen. And in this case, I was met by an elderly gentleman who walked supported by a cane. So I think he had, once I had heard his story, I think what had happened is that he had dislocated his hip, torn several muscles, and he was basically disabled for life from that point on. So he met me supported on his cane. And when I was introduced to him as this person here talking about wildlife and people, even though my focus was on predators, he was like, well, I want to tell you about my issues with elephants. And I was like, well, I'm here to listen, so let me hear it. And he told me that one evening he was coming back from town in his donkey cart. Now, as I said earlier, there's very far distances between farms and towns up in northern Namibia. So it would have taken him several hours to travel either way, probably half the day. So he arrived back at home late at night. And as he was getting off his donkey cart to go and open the gate to his yard, and this is just his yard, which is quite small and just a house in the middle, he was getting out of his donkey cart to go and open the gate. And the donkey suddenly saw an elephant that was standing in his yard and probably only a few meters away from him. And they spooked and ran. And as they ran, he caught his leg in the chain between the donkeys and the cart. So he couldn't roll away from the cart. And they dragged him for several kilometers, damaging his leg in the process, and he was left with this disability. And in this particular case, there was no form of compensation. It doesn't cover injuries. So no money was forthcoming from anyone for the damage and the disability he suffered, and he just wanted someone who was going to listen to him. And I felt helpless because I could do nothing about the situation. But I think at the end of the day, when I walked away from there, I realized that what he really wanted, is someone who was willing to listen to his story, which I duly did. So moving away from the depressing stories, this is more of a funny one. When I was working up in northwest Namibia, the conservancies all have lodges, tourist lodges that operate within their conservancies. And those lodges have to employ local people as part of their contract with the conservancy. each lodge has its own staff, and they all do little singing and dancing routines for their guests as part of their job. But some enterprising person decided to create a national, competition for singing contests. So the different lodges and their staff, they would put together their best dancing staff and singing staff, and they would do a sing and dance routine, and they would compete with each other for the national prize of the best traditional dancers in Namibia. So unbeknown to me, this was a regional preliminary trial for the singing contest. And I had just put my tent up, and this is a campsite that these people are standing in. They're standing near the reception of the campsite. And in the work that I did in those 2.5 years, because I wanted to live local, I was camping at different campsites. I would move every 2 or 3 days, and I lived like that for about 2 years. So I had put up my tent, and then these guys pulled in, and they were going to start singing and dancing. So they went out and basically collected those of us who were at the campsite and said, right, you guys sit here and judge. And I was like, what do I know about singing and dancing? I know nothing about singing and dancing. They're like, no, you are the tourists. You are the foreigners we dance for, so you must judge. And then whoever, the top 3 who come in this little contest will then go to Windhoek, and they will compete against the other people from the other regions of Namibia, and to determine who's the top dancers. So it was rather a lot of responsibility for someone who knows nothing about singing and dancing. But I was a good judge. I played along with it, and we had a very entertaining evening watching the different dances. In another incident in the same area, I was at a conservancy meeting, an AGM, with a colleague of mine, and we were there to be part of the conservancy meeting and to listen to what was going on. But as part of the sort of sideshows for that conservancy, they had a beauty contest for all the little daughters in the conservancy. So everyone's daughter came out with their dresses, they had a bikini contest too, and all sorts, and they strutted up and down a little makeshift catwalk to determine whose daughter was the most beautiful in the conservancy. But they needed judges. So they got myself and Andrew, my male colleague, to sit as judges. And once again, I said to them, I know nothing about beauty. And Andrew was like, well, I know even less about beauty. And I said, well, I don't know who knows less about beauty, but neither of us know anything about this sort of thing. And they said, no, that's not the problem. What we need is someone neutral. The point here is that it shouldn't be someone's daughter who's out there and the mother is the judge, or the aunt is the judge, because then you have bias and you cause a whole lot of chaos in the community. So we sat there and judged as neutral people. But that also taught me an interesting lesson, both of these incidents. And that is, sometimes they value the input of an outsider, not because you're an expert, not because you know everything about it, but simply because you're a neutral voice. And they particularly value neutral voices that they trust, people they know. And that can transfer from singing and beauty contests through to complicated issues of conservation that involve political dealings in the conservancies, where they just need a neutral arbitrator to listen to them and give them some input. So that was, although it was fun, both of them were fun, it also taught me something interesting. So changing gear here a little bit, one of my other passions besides human-wildlife conflict itself is engaging with different audiences about conservation generally and human-wildlife conflict. And there are several different audiences that require different approaches. So firstly, we have the government of the country in question. And I found that there's generally 2 different ways that people approach the government. You get the group of organizations or individuals who become activists, who their approach is to try and pressure the government into making policies that they deem are suitable or progressive or are useful. And sometimes the policies that they want and the actions they want from government are correct. They are good policies. It's good things that they're creating pressure for. But the way they try and get to that goal is through activism, through pressure. And that has happened certainly with lions and elephants in particular, both in Namibia and in Botswana. There were a number of organizations who went the activism approach, who were unhappy with animals being shot as problem animals, who wanted better, more stringent methods of identifying problem animals and so on. And they used their voice, particularly on social media, to try and create pressure to make the government do what they wanted them to do. And then there's another subset of organizations who prefer the cooperation approach. And this is a group of organizations who don't necessarily agree with what the government are doing, and particularly specific incidents. They think things could be handled better, but nonetheless, they feel that if they cooperate, if they find a way to contribute to the government, they can influence policies, not quite from the inside, but from a place of trust. So they focus on building trust and relationships with governments and their departments and their staff in order to influence policies, legislation, and implementation. Another audience that we have to deal with, particularly important for human-wildlife conflict, is of course farmers. And I found often that there's an attitude prevailing amongst experts, amongst the scientists, who feel that we need to teach farmers how to live with wildlife. It's about education. It's about telling them all the information that we've gained from our studies and all the stuff that they can do to protect their livestock. And it's all the big emphasis is on teaching. And I've done a lot of teaching of farmers myself, so I can't point any fingers here. And I think teaching is indeed important. But there is a slightly different approach too, which I've also seen certainly others put into practice, which is learning from the farmers, first learning from them, learning how their operations work, what are the practical issues that they have with one or another way of mitigating their conflict, and trying to figure out ways of getting around these practical issues and making the mitigation methods work for the farmers. And it's a co-learning and co-teaching process where you learn from each other and you teach each other. And that, I think, is a much better approach. Another completely different audience we have are, you have the farmers, of course, and then in every country you have a rural-urban divide. And even in African countries, the rural-urban divide is becoming quite marked. So it's not quite as bad as in the States, but there is a definite difference between the urbanites and rural people. And the urbanites can be a real pain in the butt, to be frank. They often come from a point of view where they go and view wildlife in national parks, but they don't live with that wildlife. So they often they can be a great source of support for local NGOs. They can donate to them either their time or their expertise or their money. So they can be a great base for support, or they can be a constant source of antagonism where they just try and attack any sort of attempt to compromise, to work with farmers, to understand the government's issues. All of those things they see as just compromising. So they can be a real source of antagonism as well. Finally, we get the international public, the Joe Soap living on the other side of the world. And very often that public do not understand the local situation. So in some cases, the urbanites of your own country do have some understanding of what the economic situation is like in the country. They have some understanding of how the government works. So they have some context. But the international public have very little context. So for example, the international media is always saying that elephants are about to go extinct, that they are down by so many animals, that there's they're on their last legs. There's so few elephants left in Africa, and much of that is true. However, in Namibia, the elephant population is increasing and their range is expanding. When you try and take that information out to the public, the general public, they tend not to believe you. And they just say, no, you're lying. We know that elephants are dying in Africa. So there's two options with the international public. The first option is just to ignore them because they just shout the odds and they're not engaging with the information you're sending them, so you just ignore them and carry on with your work. The other alternative is to engage with them, which is a lot of work, writing popular articles, talking on social media, so on, to actually try and get the international public to understand the local situation. So all of that said, where I really want to, the sort of point that I'm going on, I know I'm rambling a bit about various experiences and ideas, but what I'd really like to get to is the point where we can prepare young conservationists, new students coming out, studying their PhDs or masters, and we can prepare them to deal in the field of conservation in a way that merges expertise with a real understanding of the ground level. So how do we get them from the academic ivory tower, which is where they originate? It's where your student with a degree exits the ivory tower. How do we get them down to the ground level where the farmers live? Particularly rural farmers, they often have a different culture, different background, totally different worldview to students who are freshly graduated. More often than not, the students come from an urban background, a well-educated family. So there's a disconnect, and they both need to start listening to each other, sharing experiences, and even living together to understand each other's point of view. Then the next thing that I think is important for preparing conservationists is to work on communications. So at university, certainly at my university, the main drive, the main focus was scientific writing, scientific publications, and presenting skills at scientific conferences. So the focus was how to present your work, either in writing or verbally, to your peers. It was all about peer review, presenting before your peers at conferences. It's all about your peers. So your communications is with other people who understand what you understand, and you have a basis for common understanding, and you are exchanging ideas with your peers. However, in the world of conservation, you need to talk to a lot more people than just your peers. You need to get down to the ground level, to the general public, to the whosoever, the Joe Soap, and get them to understand what you understand, or at least some of it. So communications are more than just scientific writing. And I would like to see in universities some social media courses, how to deal with social media, how to write popular articles, to take your scientific articles and translate them into popular articles. I would also like to see, especially in African countries and other countries in the world where English is not the primary language, to help those to start translating their ideas and their thoughts into popular language, and to empower them to speak up on these platforms, on the public platforms. I know a lot of Namibians who are really bright, excellent conservation professionals, and although they can speak English perfectly, they don't have the confidence to speak up on social media and to tell the general public, someone from America, that this is how things work in Namibia. And it would be really great for the local universities to find a way to really empower their non-English speakers. And then thirdly, to get our students to, from the beginning, to get comfortable with the messiness of the real world. So things in academia, we tend to put things into categories, to make them more black and white. With interdisciplinary studies that we're doing more and more, we're helping, it's certainly getting towards the shades of gray. But the real world is even messier than that. So we need to get used to the idea of people with totally different perspectives. For example, the chap who was telling me about why cheetahs should be kept in captivity. To get used to dealing with that sort of totally left field idea and to think about it and to respond to those sorts of people on the ground. And then I just want to break some thoughts up, and I would really like in the discussion session for the guys who are here and online, who are viewing this online, to give some feedback and some of your thoughts about what to do. And particularly, I want to divide between universities and between the NGOs on the ground, because they often operate slightly differently. So for universities, I think there was a great value in my personal experience to take a break from academic training and do a practical internship between my honors, my last undergraduate year, and my master's. Because in that gap, I learned a whole lot more than I could ever have dreamed of learning in university. And it also had a great benefit for choosing my master's subject. So by the time it came to choose what I was going to do my master's on, I had a very clear idea that livestock guarding dogs are a promising way of reducing livestock losses on farms, and I want to learn more about them. That sort of clear concept in my head was certainly not present before I did my 1 year of practical. And so it was really important. I understand that there's a barrier to that these days. A lot of conservation organizations charge for the volunteering. I was privileged in that the organization I worked for in Namaqualand didn't charge me. They let me work there and even gave me a stipend. That is unheard of these days. But perhaps if you cannot afford to volunteer, go work on a farm. Encourage students to get out of academia. If they want to work with farmers, perhaps they need to go and work on a farm and find out how farmers really live, particularly for those students from an urban background. Another thing that I would like to see universities do is get their students to produce popular versions of scientific articles, to get them to practice writing for the public, which will really stand them in good stead for the future. They can produce these articles perhaps for local newspapers or magazines. They can see their output in print, and it just opens a door for them so that they can see that it's not all about scientific publications. It's also about communicating with the broader public. Furthermore, in these, particularly in the days of social media, that's really taken the world by storm. Facebook was only just came into existence when I was at university. Today, there's a whole plethora of different social media outlets. And I think that students can take advantage of this and take their science communication up to the next level by producing videos, animations, poems that they recite. They can get really creative these days, and there's huge opportunities to take their science to the broader public. And all of these things can be used to try and communicate the complexity of their particular field and their particular interest on social media and to the general public. And I think those skills, those soft skills, as it were, are really necessary. Some of my thoughts for the field agencies and NGOs. As I said earlier, I was given great advice to base myself in the field as much as possible. And I know that's really difficult in terms of internet connections and living conditions and all of that. But being locally based has huge value for your input into the communities, into the farming communities where you're trying to influence. And it's really important to be mentored. So Garth, who I mentioned earlier, he basically quit university in favor of mentorship. He went out and he found mentors who could teach him about ecology and conservation. And I think we can have both. We can have people who do have a university education, but realize that that is only half the picture. You can have a university education and a mentor on the ground who teaches you the practical stuff. And I think that the mentorship is really critical. In terms of also NGOs can explore different approaches to government as one of their key audiences. I especially think that activism should be kept to a minimum unless there's something absolutely critical, say the government has approved some mining activity in an extremely sensitive area, then yes, activism is necessary. But most of the time, with the complex systems around problem animal control, human-wildlife coexistence, and those sorts of policies, a much better approach is to try and come as an ally, as someone who's willing to cooperate with government, to work with them to find common solutions. And I think the government departments really do appreciate that approach. And then finally, to develop two-way communications with the public. So for an NGO that needs support and donors, local supporters from urban areas can be your biggest supporters. I know several NGOs who have the mechanics work on their cars for free. There's all sorts of people that provide huge amount of support, logistical support, and they can really be a valuable asset. Also in getting your information out and your message out on social media. Or they can be your worst nightmare. They can really stand against you on everything you do, and every time you announce something to the public, you have a whole bunch of people who just want to attack you. So it really is a balancing act, and you really have to try and work on those two-way communications. And particularly in terms of communication staff. So I don't know how it is in other countries, but especially in Namibia, the communication staff members on NGOs are usually in junior levels. They don't get taken out to the field very often. They don't have a very complete understanding of what their organization does and why they do it. And yet they are tasked with being the public face and with really, well, not really the public face, but with putting out information. They're tasked with take over the Facebook page, tweet on Twitter, post photos on Instagram. And yet they don't have a full understanding of what it is they're putting out there. And when there is a pushback from the public on something controversial, they don't have the information and the tools to hand to be able to respond to those comments and attacks adequately. So I think really NGOs should be focusing on empowering their communication staff to respond to these queries and these issues around complex issues. Okay, I think I've talked about as much as any of you want me to talk. And I really look forward to this session afterwards and your suggestions and comments on everything I've said. Please go for it. Shoot.
Well, thank you so much, Gail. That was really wonderful. We have some incredible experts on the call with us, including Dr. Adriana Consorte-McCrea, who's also a wonderful woman of wildlife. So I will invite people. You can either post your question in the chat, or, better yet, please unmute yourself or allow us to see your smiling face and jump right in so that we can start a lively discussion on these really important topics.
Hi, Aletris.
Oh, hi. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Gail. I've already, I sent my question, and I don't know if you had the chance to read, but I'm happy to ask as well, whatever you prefer.
Yes, please ask.
Okay, thanks. Gail, thank you so much. It was such a wonderful presentation, and it's a lot of experience that
thank you.
Most of us will never have, and you managed to combine so many things in such a wise way. So I'll go to my question. Is about your journey because you come from the life sciences, you ended up in this position of understanding. So how did you go from life sciences to social sciences to being social? How did that happen? Did you have a light bulb moment, or was it due to experience? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question and your comments. I'm not sure there was a particular light bulb moment, but I think I would say what really changed my view was that year that I spent between my honors and my masters. And interestingly, so when I was in life sciences, I didn't even know I wanted to study human-wildlife conflict. I was passionate about carnivores, in particular cats. So I was just like, I want to know everything there is to know about cats. That's really what I want to do. And I remember going to a conference by the Society of Conservation Biology, and they send you the program for all the different rooms. And I was completely uninterested in human-wildlife conflict. I didn't even want to sit in any of the lectures about human-wildlife conflict. I looked through the program and the agenda, and whenever there was a session on human-wildlife conflict, I was like, yep, skipping that one. Let's go to genetics. Yeah, genetics. I don't like genetics, but let's do genetics instead. So I avoided human-wildlife conflict like the plague. And that was my attitude until I actually spent a year with livestock farmers, with a conservation organization that was focused on big cats. And that was when I realized that if you don't have the farmers on board, then especially leopards, that was their focus, have no chance. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to do anything worthwhile for leopards, I've got to do this human-wildlife conflict thing. So I was a bit of a reluctant student of human-wildlife conflict. But once I got into it, I found that I was passionate about it. And I've become increasingly passionate about working with farmers. And when I left CCF, and so when I finished my master's and left up to the Northwest, and I met Gail Thomson Smith and some of the other really inspirational people in Namibia, then communal conservation became my second passion, because those communities really taught me what it's about, what conservation is about. And I learned so much from them that ever since then, I've been a major advocate for community conservation, which is something, if you told me before I left university that I would be interested in human-wildlife conflict and rural community conservation, I would have told you where to get off. Right? That was not the plan.
Yeah, such a great effort.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Haley, do you have a question?
Yes, I did. Loved the talk. That was wonderful. What my question is when you started creating those relationships with the farmers at the very beginning, did you have someone who had already created those relationships, and so they kind of helped ease you into creating that trust where this is now my colleague and you can trust her because you have a relationship? Or was it just totally out of the blue, I'm going to start creating these relationships with farmers? And if that was the case, how did you go about the finding the who and the where and beginning those relationships with those farmers and ranchers?
Another very good question. Thank you. So I was very fortunate that so as a volunteer, I couldn't just go forth and be the face of the organization for a brand new project. But I was paired up with a project manager called Ben John. And he was also brand new. Like, this was his first major job, and he didn't have a background in human-wildlife conflict. But one advantage that he did have, so he was my direct boss, as it were, because I was just the volunteer and he was the project leader. But he had an almost innate ability to talk with the farmers, particularly the farmers in the Namaqualand. We were dealing with commercial farmers, so these are white people in general. And they're very, very conservative Afrikaans people. And I'm English speaking, although my maiden name is Afrikaans. And I couldn't really speak Afrikaans. I had studied it at school, but I was not particularly fluent in Afrikaans, and I was really nervous to speak it. But Ben John was an Afrikaans speaker. He was from that part of South Africa, and he really just had a way of dealing with the farmers, and particularly because he had the same culture, he could link with them really quickly and build up a rapport with them. And I was often just the silent person in the corner who couldn't speak Afrikaans, just watching him and being like, this dude is really good. He's good at what he does. No one's taught him how to do this stuff, but he knows this stuff. And one of the really good things I learned from him was that whenever we got camera trap photos, even if it was a camera trap photo of literally a jackal killing a sheep, it was attached to the sheep's neck. He showed that photo to all the farmers, and you're like, well, maybe other people would think, that's not what you really want to be showing them. You've got to show them jackals are nice animals. But but he took that photo and he included it in the presentation, and it really thrilled the farmers to see, look, evidence, jackals are killing our sheep. And it broke the ice in a way, because they're like, you understand now. You have like information that shows that the jackals are killing our sheep. And so I found out from that, and ever since then, I thought, if I ever am in that position where I'm collecting data, you should never, ever be afraid to share that data directly with the farmers. Even if it's sensitive and you think, well, maybe they'll use this data against me, maybe they'll go find the cheetah or the jackal and shoot it, whatever. Just shelve those concerns and be honest and transparent and say, yeah, this is what we found. And let them, and that sort of honesty really builds a lot of trust with the farmers. And they realize that you're not there just to make it look like you're sort of listening to them, but you're not really. You're really there to offer them valuable information, even if it supposedly hurts your cause.
Thank you.
Let's see, so we have a lot of participants joining us from around the world, and I would just be very interested, and please feel free to chime in and tell us anecdotes or stories about how this applies to the countries that you're working in or the regions that you're working in. Because I think that that there's so much that we can all learn from each other. And Gail, I really appreciated you talking about publishing and making sure that we're disseminating our message to the general public. So much of these pearls of wisdom, as you showed us with your presentation, come from these small case studies. And it's difficult to find outlets for publishing, these like almost miniature kind of case studies that can illuminate, what's really happening at the ground level in these regions. So have you found, we have a question on whether or not you found kind of a favorite place to publish case study type anecdotes on human-wildlife conflict, or if any other participant on the call has found a favorite place, feel free to chime in.
In the scientific literature or in the public?
Either or. This question is kind of asking either or.
Okay. In terms of the public domain, I found a willing listener in Africa Geographic, for better or for worse for them, I think, because usually I publish an article and then they get a backlash of 100 people demanding that they resign or something. So unfortunately, a lot of the time it's about hunting, which is not my favorite topic, but sometimes it just has to be addressed. And I try and address it from an as objective standpoint as possible, and using the sort of stories of my experience in Northwest Namibia especially, but there's always, of course, a backlash. But they are very willing to publish things like that, and they are very keen on getting expert knowledge and expert feedback in a way that the public can understand it. So with public publishing. And I've also found, in terms of reading, the conversation is always a great place for me as a reader to go to find good stuff that's coming out of the scientific world that isn't in scientific journals. As far as journals go, I don't know, maybe one of the other participants has a favorite journal that they like to publish that sort of thing into.
Yeah, if any of the other experts have, any suggestions, please feel free to either chime in or just add that to the to our chat box so that we can all learn from each other's experiences. Let's see, we have a whole bunch of questions coming in, Gail.
Okay, good.
So let's see. We have one coming in from Maria talking about that they agree that studying conflict is the easy part of making and making changes is the most difficult. They love the idea of the grassroots movement. Any tips on how to create one? Maria is working in Greece studying wolf livestock conflicts for her PhD.
Sure. Grassroots movements are their own thing. Part of the problem with grassroots movements is that they're pretty unpredictable. So I think a lot of people are a bit intimidated by it because you don't really know what the rural farmers really want at the beginning. So you've got to be willing to also be open and change your own mind and change your own perspective and say, actually, what the farmers are looking for is better than what I thought was the way forward. And that's pretty scary because if you're going in as an expert and you have an idea of how to solve conflict, you've sort of gathered that idea from scientific articles, from all sorts of things, from your own data, and you have this concept that if only they did X, things will work out. But you go to the farmers and suddenly you realize, well, actually, they're not interested in X, they want to do Y. And you're like, well, Y is totally out of my field of expertise. I know nothing about that. What am I? I'm not an expert in that field. So part of current science is that we become so specialized that we don't really understand the next field over. Whereas a farmer, particularly, he has to deal with grazing and land rights and how his cattle production and diseases. And so a farmer's needs in terms of what they want span every discipline that we can think of in life sciences. And we aren't specialists in all of those things. No one is. So it's quite intimidating when you say, well, what do you want, farmers? And they come back to you and say, well, we really want to control disease. And you're like, well, I know nothing about disease. So that a grassroots movement can take you into places you had no idea they were going to go. And you've just got to go with it. So an example from Namibia, one that Garth shared with me. And I really valued Garth's advice and his input because he had 50, 60 years of this work behind him. And he was really an amazing chap. And he said to me, well, when we started, we said to the communities, what animals do you want? What would you like to conserve? And their answers were pretty much everything we can eat. And that doesn't kill our livestock or endanger our lives. So we'll have the gemsbok and we'll have the springbok and we'll have the zebra. And we'll have the kudu and steenbok. And those are, we want those things. But there are 3 species we shall never, ever have here. Rhino, they're dangerous. Elephants are dangerous. And lions are dangerous. And they just said, nope, those 3 things, we're not interested. That's not what we're going to conserve. So they can and instead of at that point pulling out and going, well, this isn't really conservation if you're only keeping the antelope. Garth just rolled with it and said, okay, well, a communal conservancy is about what you want. It's not about what I want. He may have wanted elephants to come back to the area. He may have wanted lions to come back to the area, but it wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what they wanted. And he was willing to just leave his ideas of, we want a whole working functional ecosystem here, and just say, nope, that's not the goal. Our goal is, what do you want? And let's go with what you want. And as a result of what they wanted, they now have the last remaining free-ranging population of black rhino in Namibia. And they are very proud of that population of rhino, and they will tell anyone who wants to listen to them that those are their rhino, they belong to them, and they will protect them. They have restored a lot of elephant range. Elephants are expanding throughout those communal conservancies, and they're somehow putting up with them. Not always in perfect peace, as you can imagine, but the elephant population is expanding, and the lion population has also expanded. They're having the biggest difficulties, I think, with the lions, mainly because of the fear factor of dealing with lions, but they have them, and it's just been a result of restoring the prey populations that they wanted. The lions said, well, thank you very much, and they came with the deal, whether the communities wanted them or not. But right in the beginning, Garth just said, okay, whatever you want. And the result has been amazing. And it's much more than he could have possibly expected in the beginning.
Okay. Yes, Dario?
Yes, thank you. So my question is, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It was quite good and quite inspiring. Do you have the same sensation that when a problem occurs after some time with no damage, no attacks, some of the work done just disappears and you need to start over again? And so you're building a relationship and you're believing that you're changing the attitudes and people thinking, but then when just one small event occurs, it just destroys sometimes the work done in one community.
It certainly can do, and often it's down to how you respond. And that's where really, as in South Africa, they say the tacky hits the tar. That's where the communities also test you, and they want to find out, are you really on their side, or are you just here for whatever wildlife is there? And that's when they separate out their allies from their foes, basically. And if you reveal yourself as one of their foes, then yeah, you can literally destroy all of that relationship building overnight. And I have seen it happen where people have been in the area for years, for a decade even, and there's a conservancy now that just doesn't want him working in their area at all, ever. They just refuse. And it was just one, it's also a flashpoint, but there's also a series of incidents, and they get to the point where they just snap and say, no, we're not going to work with you anymore. And it is usually in those highly charged, emotive times when you've got to work really, really carefully. And one of my favorite examples, once again, comes from my friend Garth. He's an elderly gentleman in his 70s when I met him. And he loved drinking tea. And I'm sure if there was cake available, he would do that too. And smoked his pipe a lot. So he's a very wizened old chap with a beard, and he liked smoking his pipe. And generally a very quietly spoken man. And there was one particular meeting that I remember, a community meeting about lions. And lions are the big hot point in the Kunene in the Northwest. So when lions start eating livestock, there are serious issues. And it's one of these things where the perception is worse than the reality, because spotted hyenas kill at least 10 times more cattle than lions do. But no one calls community meetings about spotted hyenas. It's all about lions. So you could stand there and say, well, it's all really perception. You know, what about the spotted hyenas? And they wouldn't listen to you if you took that approach. You got to take what they take seriously, you take seriously. So anyway, there was this very long, heated meeting, people arguing, you know, we should kill all the lions. No, we've decided to form a conservancy. We shouldn't kill them all. And so the person in the back is talking over the person in the front, and it really got quite hectic at one point. And Garth just sort of sits there and smokes his pipe. And at one point I was thinking, Garth isn't going to say anything. Like, he's the chap who should be saying something, but he's not saying anything. He's just smoking his pipe. And eventually he basically waited for them to ask his opinion, because at this point he had been working in that area for decades, and they really did trust him, and they viewed him as a neutral outsider who they also trusted. So it's a bit like judging a beauty contest or a singing contest. They then turned to Garth and said, well, what is your opinion? Like, we've got these guys who want this and those guys who want that. We value your opinion. And he very slowly stood up, took his pipe out, and what he said was just, he put it all in perspective, in the historical perspective, and he created a sort of, let's work together to sort this thing out, kind of. So it was not so much what he said, but the way he said it, that brought people to sort of thought. They stopped for a moment from their endless arguing, and they started to think a little bit. And yeah, I just sat there and thought, that's how you do it. And if one day I could do it like Garth does it, then I would have achieved something in my career, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you tell us which species you work with and where?
Me?
Yes, yeah.
I work with wolves in Portugal, and especially in an area with low density. So it's really tricky because when people don't see them as often. So there is a myth that they were introduced. That is the first issue. And then, so the wild prey, it's not so available. And they go sometimes with, they attack livestock. And that's the major problem. It's not continuously, thankfully, but when it occurs, it's tricky because we are building a relationship, and when an event occurs, it puts everything in perspective for them, and it was what Gail was saying. Like, you need to choose carefully what you say and how you say it, because if you go to the wrong side, you can lose the opportunity to stay with them again and to receive information from them, because they are in the field every day. And yeah, that's a major problem, but we are trying to get there and improve on these relationships.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
It is difficult, as Gail mentioned, you know, and in working with carnivores in Namibia, livestock farmers, you know, I found exactly what Gail was talking about. And, you know, so often, you know, really the kind of the light bulb moments that Adriana was talking about always occurred when my mouth was closed and I was just listening. And, you know, and they would put something into perspective that illuminated it so vividly for me that then I was able to take a step back and really kind of see things from a completely new lens. You know, but it was really difficult working with carnivore livestock conflict, because you know, we would make so much progress, as you talked about, but then there'd be a severe drought, and during that time their tolerance would decrease. You know, so they would have this increased tolerance. We'd build this relationship, but then there'd be this drought, and their tolerance would decrease. You know, they're no longer able to support any predation from predators. And so then we would take this giant step backwards and then just kind of keep building forward again. But, you know, at the same time, we now had this wonderful working relationship. And so even though it appeared that we were taking a step backwards as far as, you know, the numbers that were being killed of carnivores, you know, we had still maintained this level of trust and transparency that I was receiving all of that information and now understanding why these carnivores were being killed in the first place. And so, so I think that, this kind of waxing and waning when dealing with human-wildlife conflict is a natural part of the process. But, I found that just sticking with it is really the only way to move forward. I don't know, Gail, if you can add to that any based on your experience.
Yeah, definitely. I think the value of the relationship is more than the value of a particular individual animal. So even in the case of lions in the Kunene, there were 5 male lions that were part of a coalition that had become superstars because they were filmed and people made a documentary out of them. So there was huge public interest and pressure about these particular lions. But the lion researcher there at the time, Flip Stander, he also was really good at what he did. And he basically outlined to the community that these 5 lions need X amount of meat to survive. And guess what? They're living where you're living now, and they're growing up, and they are going to cause huge problems. So he was totally like, he didn't try and gloss over it, like, oh no, lions are fine, they won't bother you. He just said, they're big cats, they need this amount of meat, there's probably not this amount of meat available in the ecosystem, so they will come for your livestock, and we better start planning for it now. And that was quite a brave thing for him to say. And unfortunately, all 5 of those lions were later killed in human-wildlife conflict incidents, which is a huge blow for the population. There's not that many lions out there. Huge blow for Flip. I mean, those lions were, as I say, superstars, so they were bringing in quite a bit of money off the back of that documentary. And you just had to take it and still carry on with the relationship. I mean, you could, at that point, throw in the towel and say, bugger it, I'm just going to work on something else or go work with a different community or something. But he hung in there, and he's now got an early warning system going that seems to be starting to bear fruit. And people are basically, collared lions are coming in contact with cell phone towers or specially equipped towers. He's warning the community about their approach, and the community are basically protecting their livestock before the lions come too close. So because he stuck with it, even after that huge tragedy, he is really seeing the fruits of his labor, but it's taken a very, very long time. So your level of patience gets tested severely, but you have to hang in there.
Okay, another quick question. Gail, can you quickly talk about dealing with difficult opposing views? So when consensus was difficult to reach, and how you would approach and solve this when dealing with communities.
Opposing views from the public or between people in the community? Is there any clarity on that, or just opposing views in general?
I think so. Talking about, I think when dealing with communities where there's opposing views, based on different leadership and kind of how you deal with that.
Yeah. So there's working in communal conservancies, especially, was a big challenge in diplomacy. Because there's a lot of undercurrents in politics going on that you don't even know about as an outsider. So you're just sitting there and you're wondering why they're all arguing with each other. But you don't realize that they've had someone once upon a time accused someone else of stealing his goat, and they still have this issue, this underlying issue that's going on. And oftentimes, as an outsider, you can't really do a lot. Because you're not there to sort out their social problems. And if you start overstepping your bounds and start saying, right, you're wrong and you're right, and you don't have a full understanding of their background and the underlying issues that go into that conflict, you might be on the wrong end of the stick because you're just judging from a face value thing, and meanwhile there's something else going on there that you know nothing about. So I always found it wisest to shut up for as long as possible until someone actually asked you what your opinion was, because they will ask you if they value your opinion, if they value you as a trusted neutral person, they will eventually ask you. But if it's deeper than that and it's some political issue that they know you don't understand, they'll leave you out of the conversation, and that's actually a grace, because you're like, well, this is not my fight. So, and maybe later after the meeting, after the argument, when everything's settled down, you can go ask someone who knows both people, who knows the situation, to fill you in on the gaps and be like, oh, that's why they hate each other, because so and so stole so and so's wife, 3 years ago. So so then you get an idea of what's going on, and you don't put your foot in your mouth, as it were. It's very easy to make a misstep and a misjudgment if you're working in a community that you don't know intimately. And chances are, as a neutral outsider, you don't know all the ins and outs of who's doing what. And in that same vein, there was one particular time where I was sorely tested to step in. And in the end, I was like, nope, I can't, I mustn't. There was a communal conservancy, and communal conservancies are run, or the decisions are made, by an elected committee. So they're elected on democratic principles, and you all just have to cast your vote and you elect so-and-so in. Now, we all know how democracy works and how the most populist person who's lying about what they can do for you and how amazing the place will be if he's in charge, and how he's going to give all his friends jobs, and just is on a ticket of lying and deceit. And we can spot these politicians from a mile away. Well, communal conservancies are no different to the rest of us. They have their fair share of charlatans and people who are there just for the power, and they will say anything to get into that power. So there was a young chap who was running for the chairperson position, and all of the NGOs that were there and all of the government officials that were there, we knew that this chap was a charlatan. We just knew it. It was pretty obvious. His behavior, his record of behavior beforehand was awful. He had written off a vehicle because he was drunk. He had done all sorts of things, and we knew he was the wrong person. But enough of the youth in that conservancy were won over by him that they voted him in. And the government certainly, I mean, it wasn't my place to step in, but the government could have stepped in and said, no, this is invalid. But they realized that this is democracy. So wisely, they said, you want him, you got him. It took a couple of years for him to destroy the Conservancy's vehicle and almost destroy the entire reputation of the Conservancy and run the place into the ground. But eventually they learned that lesson and they voted him out. And we can't just step in and say, oh, we want you to have democracy, but only on our terms when you elect the right person, because that's very patriarchal of us. We've got to let them, democracy has to be democracy, and let them make their own mistakes. So there's a big sort of, it's tempting to weigh in and say, no, I know best and I know what you should decide, when you really should just take a back seat and say, I know you're going wrong, but you've got to learn from your own mistakes.
Very, very good point. I think, too many times with working with various organizations and just from conducting qualitative interviews with so many livestock producers, I found that, too often organizations come in with that savior complex and, want to like save everyone and preach all of their knowledge, and no one appreciates that regardless of what you're working on. It's and so having that approach where I try to always keep in mind everyone I'm talking with that they're an expert on something that I know nothing about, and that helps me kind of try to glean as much information based on their expertise as I possibly can. So really good point, Gail. And then Claudia has a great comment. Just wondering on how often we assess some of these human dimensions and the social aspect before reintroductions, especially on carnivores, take place. And you know, just my perspective would be, you know, way too rarely do we do this and lay that groundwork. However, there are fantastic organizations. Adriana's organization with the working group with the IUCN is laying the groundwork and is really pioneering these efforts. But what are your thoughts on this, Gail?
I think part of the problem is that we view conservation as a crisis science, which is true. So we feel like we have to move quickly. So if you're going to reintroduce the species, you've got to reintroduce it within this time frame in order to make a difference, because this particular subpopulation or subspecies or species is going extinct. So you've got to do something. You've got to reintroduce it. You've got to have some action. And we've also got a lot of pressure, obviously donor pressure and all sorts of other pressure to see results. And unfortunately, building local grassroots support doesn't take that sort of level of time. It takes at least 10 times longer than that. So what a project that you have funding for 3 years, it'll take 3 decades to get the support that you need, the full support that you need to make that project a reality. And if you don't have 3 decades, well, you're going to run into some opposition. So I don't know how we creatively try and reduce the time that people take to develop their own support. I don't even know if that's possible, depending on the culture and the background. It might be. But I think a lot of the time we underestimate how long it takes for these things to happen. And by underestimating that, we just jump in boots first and then ask questions later. And by that time, it's too late. So it's a tricky one.
Good point. And it also is difficult to find the funding that's necessary, you know, for these projects too, because, you know, it's difficult to write into a grant that you need 2 years to establish relationships and you know, create the trust and actually learn what the true problems are on the ground. You know, people, you know, there's often not those types of pockets of money available out there. So that does make it very, very difficult. So in so many ways, we're almost set up to fail, you know, in how we currently approach many of these problems. So that's a very good point.
And your final report might read that you drank 2,000 cups of tea this year.
Yes.
Which is probably not what the donor was looking for.
Yeah, point. And then Adriana chimed in that that's absolutely the case. And it's, you know, hard to reconcile reintroduction with building relationships and with communities, you know, and listening, working together. But it has to be done. And that group is, you know, Adriana's group, working group with the IUCN is doing just this. So really, really important topics to, you know, to advance in the future, and we all need to talk about it. And you're right. So many of these barriers make it very challenging for us to accomplish, you know, real conservation change on the ground in a productive way. So good point. Yeah, Leah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did actually. I've been out of school for almost 2 years now, and realize exactly what you were saying. There's so little education in the academic scientific world that teaches you how to communicate with the public, with people who aren't in the scientific realm. And I've slowly had to gain those skills, and then before trying to go off to grad school. So it's been kind of inspiring to hear that I'm on the right path. But I'm not sure if you could answer my question, or maybe you just have some thoughts, but why is it that academics are set up that way in like college systems? There's not that teaching process of how to speak with someone outside of the scientific world.
Oof, big question. It's true. And why we're that way, I suppose it is part of the tradition and culture of science, is that you study for so long to be an expert. And then once you're an expert, you've developed your own vocabulary. And this is one of the things that, as a life scientist trying to read social science, I've basically stopped reading social science papers because they're Greek. They're absolutely Greek to me. And that's someone who's who has some idea of how to read a journal article. and I just cannot get through the vocabulary of a social scientist. And they are speaking to each other in their own language. And no doubt I speak to biologists in our own language. And it gets to the point where it's second nature and you don't even realize you're speaking your own language. It's just, that's everyone around you in your department. That's the way they refer to stuff. And so, I mean, and a very simple example is using abbreviations and acronyms, HWC. We sort of use that all the time. And then someone says, hang on, what is that? And you're like, you don't know? So that's a very simple example of the sort of thing that we just create a language that only we speak in. And very few people can unlearn that language and relearn how to talk to their grandmother about what they do. So that's, I think it's a very big step to basically unlearn how to write science, because you spend 3, 4, 5 years learning how to write scientifically. And then at the end, for someone to tell you, no, you've got to dumb this down so that the public can read it. Well, what have you spent the last 5 years doing? So there's also a lot of resistance from scientists to dumb themselves down because they have expertise and they want to show that they have expertise. So you use your language to basically advertise that you're an expert in the field. But that also excludes like 90% of the population from understanding what you're talking about. Which is probably fine in other sciences. So if you have a bunch of astrophysicists talking to each other, they can speak their own language. None of us really need to know what goes into astrophysics. But in conservation, we matter because our field is directly interfacing with the general public, with people on the ground. And we can't just exclude the general public. We don't have a choice. We have to speak to the general public. So I think of all the fields, conservation really needs to get this right.
Right, thank you. I think everything you said made the justification for your suggestions for university slide. All right, thank you.
And I think that's such a great point, Gail. You know, I found, you know, when working with human-wildlife conflict that, you know, again, I had approached it again traditionally as that hard biological scientist. And then yet found that I was, you know, about to end up with a PhD and I didn't have any of the skills I needed to truly address human-wildlife conflict. But I didn't even speak the appropriate social science language. So I had to go back to school, you know, and again, kind of start from the ground up, which is really difficult to do, just so that I could speak the right language, you know, the social science language, to even be able to collaborate and ask the right questions with social scientists. So you're right. I mean, so much of this is kind of people speaking, you know, like missing each other and kind of just, you know, conversations going over each other's heads because we're not communicating effectively. And Flavia has a really great comment, not to mention the different meanings and use of the same terms. You know, so many times we also assume that, you know, my meaning of conservation is the same as your meaning of conservation. And, you know, and sometimes, you know, I think that's where taking a step back and listening to what someone's kind of what their interpretation of these words are, it can be very valuable. So, yeah, and particularly in like social sciences, it can be, and psychology can be really confusing if you come from an ecological background, you know, exactly what you said. And so, you know, I agree 1,000% with what you're saying and the recommendations that you're making. That's really valuable. I think any other last minute questions from any of our participants, or we've taken up a lot of your time. Gail, do you have anything else that you would like to add to the group, or any closing remarks?
I finally found the chat box.
Okay, okay.
I see there's one person here who says, are there any tips for writing your scientific papers into local level communications? That takes its own ability and its own, so that's why I'd really like a course in universities on that sort of thing, because I think it does take a lot of work. And in my current role, I work for an organization called Namibian Chamber of Environment. So I am an independent consultant, but I consult for them. And one of the main things that I do for them is just that, is people from Namibia, Namibian scientists, send me their articles and their reports. And I usually try and get them to try and write it in their own language for public format. So just tell them, take your best shot at it. Try and explain it like you're explaining to your grandmother. And I find that very few people are able to do it. And I have to then take and panel beat that article into something that someone would actually want to read that isn't in that field. And I think in the process, I hope I'm teaching some of those people how to translate their scientific work into a language that people can understand. And I think this is doubly difficult for people whose first language is not English. Because English is my first language, I have learned how to speak English as a baby. So I know how to do baby talk in English. But someone who has come from, say, they're a Namibian person who speaks Damara, their home language is Damara. So they know how to talk to their friends and, growing up at school. They know how to speak Damara to their friends. But they only learn English when they go to university, really learn to write English, to write scientifically at university. So they've learned English as a second language in school. But by the time they get to their scientific career, they're writing scientifically in English, and that's what they learn. And so their English is basically a high level of English. And I found this with one particular Afrikaans chap I knew, is that he didn't speak English very well when he came to university, and he left university with his PhD. And even his conversational English was as though he was writing a scientific paper. So to get that person who's now learned that as this is how you speak English, to try and bring it down to a level of the rest of the English speakers in the world, that's a huge step, a learning curve for them to do. And it's really difficult, and I really feel for them, and I wish more universities would try and support them to do that.
Very good point. Gail, I'll never forget, you and I gave a presentation to a group of, I think, it was essentially the entire elementary school in Windhoek, or outside of Windhoek at a school. And that was really good advice that I was given once. And so I had a fellowship from the National Science Foundation during my PhD to translate science to K through 12 students. And I found that was one of the best kind of initiation by fire learning experiences I've ever had. And how do you talk about this complex science? And you don't need to dumb it down, but you just need to communicate it in a way that other people can understand. And so, if you can communicate these complex problems to fourth graders, then I think you can talk about them, to anyone without, talking down to people and making them, feel smaller. So really, really good point. Flavia also comments that there are whole courses on scientific communication, and it's still very difficult. And the work usually done by journalists who don't have scientific training and often interpret your points, and that's a whole nother trajectory of you.
And they muck it up.
Yeah. Difficult for us as scientists to work with the journalists. It's also difficult for the journalists to work with us. And so, training specifically on that aspect of communication is really important. I don't know if you wouldn't mind just touching on that just really quickly.
Yeah, journalists are also their own type of thing, and I've because of the new stuff that I'm doing now, I'm trying to learn a little bit more about journalism so that I can get better at my public communication, because I think we can learn a lot from journalists and how they build a story and how they hold readers' attention, because that's their job, that's their way of doing things. So they have those skills that we need. So I've bought a book or two on a journalist's point of view, and there's one particular one, I can't think of the title right now, but it's basically helping people from a science background to become a science communicator and go into journalism, or vice versa, journalists to become a science communicator by learning about science. And I found it really interesting just figuring out how journalists do what they do and why they do what they do. Up to this point, I've just been going by, I've read enough enough popular publications that I sort of get it. But I don't know the mechanics of how they do it. And doing that, getting that sort of basis, that's sort of what would a course in university would look like, is getting the very basics of journalism through to science students, or getting the very basics of science through to journalists. And it would be really good to do a bit of a crossover, if at all possible. And I know students are pretty busy with studying what they need to study, but it would be nice to at least have an elective course on journalism / science communication in universities.
Very good point. I mean, truly to be effective at solving and mitigating these problems, human-wildlife conflict, I mean, we need to build these conservation teams or have the skills of, journalists, hard scientists, social scientists, psychologists, so we need so many tools at our disposal to actually be effective. And I think that, that's only something that you can learn through experience. I think naively, so many organizations and individuals think that they can just, gain the knowledge of the basic natural history of these species and then just go and share that information with people. And it's as simple as that, kind of wipe their hands and feel like they've solved something. And as you illustrated so beautifully through so many of your stories, that's really not the case. And in fact, it can create significantly more harm than not doing anything at all. So we just have to be really, really careful with how we approach these problems. But I just really want to thank you, Gail. This was such a great conversation, and I really appreciate you spending so much time talking with us. So please join me in thanking Gail for her incredible work and her presentation and all she's doing to conserve Namibian people, communities, and wildlife. Just a reminder that this talk will be was recorded and will be posted on the Conservation Catalyst website. And so please, if you'd like to review it or share that information with colleagues or friends, that's where you would do so. I would also just like to make a plug. If anyone has someone that they would like to nominate as a wonderful woman of wildlife, please feel free to get in contact with me. The email is at the front of this chat box. And please join us next month, again, the first Wednesday of every month. That'll be the 3rd of March. And we have Thembi. She will be talking with us, or meeting with us from Zambia, talking about human-carnivore conflict mitigation in a changing landscape. And so I think it will build on so much of what we just spoke about with Gail's presentation and what we've talked about with some of our past presentations. And so it'll be great to continue these conversations next month as well. And so Gail, just thank you so much. That really was absolutely fantastic. And you covered the breadth of what you covered and kind of distilled into these very digestible chunks and with these really illuminating stories was really wonderful. So you're a great storyteller, and we all appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Aletris. I enjoyed that.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on where you're at. And please join us again next month. So thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Gail.
Let me unmute that. Thanks. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you. It's so great to see you again.
Yeah.
It's just wonderful to see you.